Have you told your friends that you see ghosts?
Oh, absolutely not.
Gina Rodriguez returns in Not Dead Yet.
I'm back, baby.
Who is that?
Oh, she's the obituary writer.
And Brad Garrett joins the brilliant ensemble cast.
Titan, Maverick, Titan of all Mavericks. These are all words used to describe me.
Not Dead Yet. Season premiere. Tonight, 8:30, 7:30 Central on ABC. And stream on Hulu.
It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
It seems that the ways that we can get ourselves in trouble on screens never ends, especially when it comes to our children. Children, screens, and something called capping is the conversation today. Before we go any further and I introduce my guest, just a reminder that some of the things that we'll be talking about today are for mature audiences. With all of these things with online dangers, there is the risk that some little ears might be a little bit too curious too soon. However, I don't think that's a big deal when it comes to these conversations because we need to be having them. So I'll leave it to your discretion. Certainly if the kids aren't listening to this conversation, we do want you to have a conversation with your kids about this conversation because, like I said, there's no end to the different ways that kids can find themselves in trouble online. Joining me today, as always, to talk about these topics is Detective Superintendent Jayne Crossling from the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, or ACE, as it's better known. You can find out more about ACE at accce, that's accce.gov.au. Jayne, thanks for being with me on the podcast today. What is capping?
In its most simple terms, capping is where a young person is tricked or coerced or threatened into creating sexual acts, including video and images, and then those sorts of images are then screenshotted or capped, hence the name. And it could be that the young person doesn't know that that's actually happened. So they think that they're sharing material with somebody online that they have maybe been tricked into thinking they're actually sharing with someone they know or someone of a similar age. They don't realise that that's all being screenshotted. Then that material is frequently shared with other people. And so in some instances, the young person doesn't even know that they're actually a victim of a few different types of crimes.
So I want to drill into how this works. You're talking about kids thinking that they're talking to somebody that they know, but it turns out to either not be that person or they've been deceived in some way. What's going on here? Like, who's doing this to our children and why?
Unfortunately, there are online offenders out there that have an appetite for this type of material where they are doing it because they have a sexual interest in children. And in many instances, they're actually connected to other offenders who also like sharing this material. So once they're able to receive this material, they're allowed to share with their friends and they get kudos amongst their online network for sharing this particular material.
So last time we talked, we spoke about the sextortion or sexual exploitation of children. That is that there are people working in call centres, literally as paid employees overseas, who are pretending to be an attractive young female, for example, and approaching a teenage boy and saying, hey, here's an intimate picture of me and will you send me one of you now? Like they'll spend a little bit of time developing the relationship over maybe 5 or 10 minutes or maybe 5 or 10 days. Then they get that image in front of the boy. The boy goes, oh my goodness, that was astounding. And now I'm emotionally a little bit hot, I guess you might say. And then the request comes through from this quote unquote girl saying, now send me one. He does that. And then she says, actually, I'm not who you think I am. Send me some Bitcoin. Otherwise, I'm going to share this with your entire list. It sounds to me like what you're describing as capping is quite different. That is, this isn't done for financial gain. This is actually done simply for personal satisfaction. I don't like using that word in this context, but it sounds like this is a thing that there are predators who are literally trying to have children expose themselves online so that they can get access to that content and then share it within their dark web groups so that they can become more powerful in those circles.
Correct. Or it's entirely for their own personal consumption as well, because they, as I said, they do have a sexual interest in children. So it can be standalone offending. It can be syndicated offending as well. We're seeing a range of different offending play out, and it unfortunately is a global network at times. And this is where the power of the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation really comes in, because we've got those connections with law enforcement. So this is giving us a really strong sense of how it's playing out around the globe. So what typically is happening is that children are being actively targeted in a very similar way as you described to sexual extortion.
Jayne, who's most likely to be affected here? Is there a particular age group? Who is the target of these? I'm going to use the word predators. I don't know that there's a better word for it.
So they are young people generally, and the ACE certainly only focuses in on under 18s, but we are most commonly seeing teenage children being affected by this.
Okay. Would it be reasonable to say, though, that there are some bad actors out there who are very active in children's games as well, games for kids that are under 12?
That might be a way that they're initially friending the children through in-game chat functionality, but frequently they're taking them out of that space so that they can actually have direct message capability with them. Frequently that's in an encrypted environment, but then they need to get into a video chat particular app. So that's where they're lured into whichever particular video chat app that the offender chooses and is their preference.
Let me ask a really concrete question. I know it's hard to give a simple answer to this question, but how long do most offenders, most predators take to develop a relationship, make the request, get the child, the teenager, the young person off the platform that they're on and into the encrypted chat or video service and obtain exploitative material?
Unfortunately, it's getting shorter and shorter, the amount of time that it takes for these offenders. In years gone by, this type of offending would have taken quite some time to convince a young person, A, to friend someone that they don't know, and B, to actually then respond to the sharing of sexualised images. So this is a huge cause for concern for us, and it would appear that some of those red flags are being ignored by the young people, or they're just not tuning into them. And this is why we certainly need to appeal to parents and carers, because they play a critical role.
Can we please get really clear on what those red flags are that are being ignored by the kids? Because obviously parents need to talk about this with their kids. Therefore, they need to get the highlighter out and circle where the red flags are and say, hang on, this is a line. Like, don't cross this line. This is not safe behaviour. This is not healthy behaviour. What are the red flags that parents want to be talking to their kids about?
So the very key one that starts off is that you are friended by someone you don't know. So what a young person might call a random, or maybe we're calling them randoms, but they're random. And much like sexual extortion, the conversation can become sexualized, and that can happen quite rapidly. They may or may not share images of purporting to be themselves, but perhaps not. And then they will most definitely push them into a different platform so that they can get onto the platform of their choice so that they can actually create the video.
I keep on thinking of Madonna King's advice in her book, Saving Our Kids, the book that she wrote about Task Force Argos and the work that the ACE has been doing over the years. And this advice that she was just screaming through a megaphone throughout the book, and that is, don't let your kids have their devices in the bedroom or the bathroom. Just don't let them do that, because if they're in a public area, they're not going to take their gear off and send it to some random on the internet, whereas bathrooms and bedrooms, this is where the exploitation happens. You're nodding your head as I'm looking at you on Zoom. Can you just extrapolate on that briefly?
Absolutely. And this goes for children of all ages as well. We particularly recommend supervision for younger children because, unfortunately, we have instances where young children themselves have been able to take unclad images of themselves or video and themselves load them into social media services. And sometimes the parents are completely unaware.
So I want to ask you a question about that, Jane, and it's a really hard question to ask. In so many ways, I don't want the answer, but I think that every parent who's listening needs to know the answer so that they know that this is serious. What's the youngest age of a child that you know who has been involved in a capping incident?
I believe that there would be children as young as 10, from what I understand. But as I said, it's predominantly the teenage years that we are most concerned about.
Okay. But I think that it's worth pausing on this and just highlighting, so my youngest is 9, right? And it won't be too long till she's 10. She's such a tiny, tiny kid. And it's just, I think it's that reminder. A lot of parents say, oh, my kids aren't doing this or they're not doing that or they're safe because I've had this conversation. And I keep coming back to this idea that they're just not safe. They're kids. It's like when we were doing parental guidance together, Jane, and we've got these kids that are accepting invitations from strangers to disclose personal details, even though the parents are sitting there saying, but we've had the conversation. In terms of keeping our kids safe, I don't think we can be strong enough on this. Keep the phones out of the bedroom and bathroom and recognise that kids as young as 10, maybe even younger, are going to be approached and they need to know how to respond. It just seems to me like it's a massive parental responsibility. I want to talk about the practical stuff from parents for just a sec, but I have 2 questions that are really, raging inside of me. One of them is just what's the law on this? I mean, it's obviously illegal, but what are we really talking about from a lawful perspective here? And is it the same in Australia as it is elsewhere?
So the laws vary, unfortunately, state by state in Australia, and then also differ internationally as well. And the police response also differentiates as well across state and territories in Australia. So in relation to self-generated content, what the ACE is very strong on is that we generally don't want to criminalise that behaviour for a young person. And we want to look at the circumstances in which self-generated material was actually created. So were they tricked? Were they coerced? Were they led to believe that they were sharing with somebody that they knew or that they trusted? What happened in relation to having that self-generated material created? Then for those matters to be investigated by police, if that was just a standalone matter of self-generated material, police in each state and territory would need to take into account what are the motivations of those involved. Was it mutual? Was it consensual? And was it just perhaps that the young people were exploring, what are essentially adult concepts, but something that we do see quite commonly in the teenage years. So we do say that if there's been threats or coercion or trickery involved in the generation of this self-created material, that a young person is essentially a victim in that situation, and that a young person isn't actually to blame for falling victim to that kind of online offender. And we believe that in all circumstances, these matters are complex and they need to be handled with sensitivity and care to ensure that the young person is actually not re-victimised through the process. So if it is a non-aggravated circumstance, that there is mutual consent, that perhaps sharing got a little bit out of hand, and that's how it came to law enforcement attention, then a police response around the country ideally and typically focuses on education and prevention. But as soon as police get a sense that there's more to it, that perhaps there's other elements here where there's adults involved, and as I mentioned, is that there's threats and coercions, that is where they'll actually look at this quite differently and want to understand the circumstances. And that's exactly how some of these capping and sometimes sexual extortion matters are uncovered.
Jane, AI is becoming an increasingly relevant part of this discussion in terms of explicit material being both sought for and generated and even shared. Does that come into this capping and sexual exploitation discussion at all?
There's a chance that when an offender approaches a young person, that they've actually used AI-generated images in order to lure that young person in. So it could be that it's actually not a real person of any sort, and that offenders will seek to hide behind an artificially created profile picture that is presumably attractive for the person they're trying to, offend against. So, yes, we would see AI utilised in that particular way, most definitely.
Yeah, the world is changing in frightening ways. My last question, because our time is running out fast and parents need solutions. This is the podcast for the time poor parent who just wants answers now. Now that we've discussed capping and what it is, how do parents talk about this with their children? What are your top couple of tips?
Okay, so we've got so much advice to offer in this regard. We do not for a moment want parents to think that they're helpless. We want them to be able to feel that they're up for the challenge. So we would say, firstly, have an environment that is open and non-judgmental. And we've talked about having conversations, really open conversations, and that they can't just be one-offs. They cannot be set and forget. They need to be frequent, and it needs to adapt as we see these sorts of crimes adapt as well. So you as a parent, you might find it quite nerve-wracking and uncomfortable, but this is a better scenario than having to deal with the worst-case scenario at the end of the day. It's important to have these conversations, and we stress to parents that they need to avoid judgmental language. They need to avoid making judgments themselves about, how could you do this? How could you be so silly? We want to ask that they push past all of that and get to the heart of the problem, because we know that for young people, shame can be a significant barrier in order to come forward, and that could actually make them even more vulnerable to ongoing exploitation. So we want them to speak up. We want them to feel comfortable enough to be able to share what's happening in their lives. And offenders will use isolation tactics and shaming, and that will stop reports coming forward. So parents need to find a way to push past that. Parents also have a role more broadly to teach kids critical thinking about how they interact with people online, and that simple message about not everybody is who they say they are online, and to keep that thinking up at all times when they're operating online. We have, some major tips that we always talk about for parents and carers. In addition to open conversations, supervision is essential, particularly for younger users. It's important to check your privacy settings to understand how much information a young person's putting out there in the world. Be approachable if your child needs help, and then know how to report.
For more great advice on how to keep our families safe online, especially our children, teenagers, all young people, visit the ACE website, accce.gov.au. All of those resources that Detective Superintendent Jayne Crossling has just mentioned are available there, and they will keep your family safe. It's an important conversation. It's too important to not have it. Jayne, as always, so grateful for the work that you do and for the time that you've spent explaining this to us to help us to keep our families safe on the Happy Families podcast.
Thank you.
Detective Superintendent Jayne Crossling from the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. It's scary, isn't it? It's just so frightening that we live in a world where there are people who have these motivations. Thank goodness we have people like Jayne and those who work with her to help out. If you'd like more information about making your family safe, like I said, visit the ACE website or check out what we have to offer to guide your family at happyfamilies.com.au.